I'm really, really honored to be joined by Cherien Dabis, who's the producer, writer, and director of a truly extraordinary film, All That's Left of You, that I've had the privilege of watching. I would say one of the most powerful films that I have watched, not just about Israel-Palestine, but about anything. The story starts with a family in Jaffa, a prosperous family. And I'm curious, as you were thinking about how to use one family to tell the story about the Nakba, I'm curious about your decisions to choose Jaffa and to choose a family that was particularly prosperous, kind of bourgeois, and how you thought about the reasons for choosing them.
Well, a number of reasons. Palestinians of all socioeconomic levels lost everything during that
Yes.
time. And so
Yes.
I really did want to show that Palestinian refugees came from all kinds of places and all socioeconomic classes. I wanted there to really be a huge disparity in their quality of life
Mm.
from the 1948 portion to the next segment of the movie where we see them living in a refugee camp and we
Yes.
see the massive difference between where they
Yes.
used to live and where they live now.
Yes.
That was really important to me. I started it in Jaffa because Jaffa was the pride of Palestine. It was the
Mm.
center
Mm.
of cultural and economic life. It was covered in orange groves.
Mm.
Palestinians had really successful orange export business. People ate Jaffa oranges all over the world. To this day, I think people still hear about Jaffa oranges, but don't necessarily connect them to Palestine during this time period.
Mm.
And I grew up Palestinian American in the diaspora. My father was exiled from Palestine in 1967. So I grew up in a country that really held on to this myth that Palestine was a land without a people
Mm.
for a people without a land. And I wanted to show something that is absolutely true, but that so many people don't know, which is that we were there,
Mm.
not just as Bedouins and farmers, but we had an urban society. We had cinemas and we had soccer clubs and we had schools and newspapers. And this is something that we've never really seen in cinema before. We've never seen urban Palestine in the 1940s.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
And I thought it was really important to show.
So it very clearly counters a lot of the racist stereotypes that people have about Palestinians in Palestine and what it was like.
Absolutely. And I think it burst that myth wide open, that myth that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. Like when you see urban society and culture with hundreds of thousands of Palestinian people, I mean, not that you see that in the film, but you
Mm.
understand it because you know that Jaffa is the city. Tel Aviv was the suburb, which
Yeah.
you do understand from the movie. I've had a number of people come up to me and be like, I had no idea that Jaffa was the city and Tel Aviv was the
Mm. Mm.
suburb. It's like the opposite of what it is today. And even just that
Mm.
got them thinking, got them to sort of understand the erasure in a way.
Mm. And when you were making the project, were there films, either Palestinian films or even non-Palestinian films, that you think were dealing with a similar challenge, which is to bring to light a group of people who have been erased and to tell a history that has been erased?
I think I found more inspiration in books, to
Mm.
be
Mm.
honest. Even history books, like
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
found more inspiration from anecdotal stories
Mhm.
that actually happened to real people. I found a lot of inspiration in literature,
Mm.
whether it was like Mornings in Janine or On the
Mhm.
Hills of God or these novels that really are sweeping.
Mm.
So those were kind of the Palestinian novels, but then, kind of historical books as well that I was really reading and immersing myself in when I was developing the story. And funny enough, the films that I think impacted me were Hollywood epics. And a lot
Mm.
of them were
Mm.
like Holocaust or war films. And those are,
Mm.
again,
Mm.
like the movies I grew up with, like Steven Spielberg was the filmmaker of my
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah.
And those
Yeah.
were the films that I grew up watching and always wondering, like, well, why isn't our story told this way? Our story is one for the
Yes.
epics.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
one for those. It's like really material for that type of epic film. And I wanted to take that genre of like classic Hollywood epic and really
Right.
apply it to the Palestinian narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting you mentioned Spielberg, because one of the things that I've noticed in the Jewish community is that I think one of the reasons that the Nakba is such a frightening thing to deal with is that once you deal with it at a human level, it's actually very difficult for Jews not to see echoes of this story of trauma and dislocation,
Yeah.
and to be
Yeah.
very, I mean, all people, obviously, but
Yeah.
maybe Jews even more than your average American, the sense of family
Right.
scattered across places with
Yep.
intergenerational trauma, and then it moves you very fast into a place where politically you've forced to confront very, very fundamental questions about the nature of the Zionist project.
Right.
I wanted to ask a little bit about how your own family's experience. My understanding is your father was forced out of Palestine in 1967 in what people call the Nakba, so
Right.
another Palestinian expulsion, but one that came later, and
Yeah.
how your experience of seeing him grapple with that informed your decision to tell the story of 1948.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely grew up with his heartache over his exile. It took him, like the characters in the film, it took him many years to get foreign citizenship just to return to visit his family and the only home he'd ever known. And I watched him, over the course of my life, I watched him become more and more disillusioned and angrier. I watched his health suffer because of the worsening situation back home, because of the anger, because of his clinging to the past. And I would say, in some ways, seeing that kind of informed my own identity. I saw that the way he was dealing with the situation, his obsession with politics over the injustices wasn't working, that it was causing him so much suffering. And I was like, I don't want to suffer like that. Like, how can I deal with this differently? And so almost like my identity formed in opposition to his. And I wanted to look towards the future and really kind of see if there's anything that I could do to try to be helpful in the situation. And so at a certain point, when I was thinking about the story, I was really thinking about that intergenerational trauma and the way that our identities form in relationship to our environments and kind of the political fallout of what's happening wherever we live. And that was the part that I felt like, especially as a Palestinian American in the US, I felt people don't see this part of what it is to be Palestinian. I mean, people have such a kind of very narrow view of Palestinians. For the most part, we're rendered nameless, faceless headlines, just numbers. People don't really get any emotional window or insight into the actual experience of living under occupation for all of these decades, of being displaced multiple times. People don't really get to see Palestinian humanity and all of the humanity that Palestinians and the grace that Palestinians have given and have upheld. And I grew up seeing that and feeling that. My experience of being Palestinian is one of family and love and compassion and grace and generosity, like too much generosity, and I wanted to honor that. And I wanted to honor how Palestinians became refugees by telling that story. But I also wanted to look at my own inheritance of trauma. And in some ways, this movie is like an exploration of the inheritance, not only of the intergenerational trauma within my family, but the collective trauma of the Nakba. Because every Palestinian has that trauma. It doesn't matter if your parents or grandparents survived it or not. You grew up hearing these stories. You grew up feeling like you weren't allowed to talk about it. You still feel like you're being censored if you talk about it. Like, it's still to this day is something that in certain circles, you're like, I don't know if I can be talking about this right now. You could be attacked if you talk about it in the wrong kind of situation. And so I think that it continues to be a trauma. And until we are able to, at a minimum, recognize that trauma, recognize the trauma of the Palestinian people, recognize all that they have suffered, and recognize their humanity, like I don't know how we could ever have a just peace without that at a minimum.
Yes, I mean, this is something that I feel like sometimes I've tried to say to Jewish friends and audiences. Obviously, the Holocaust and the Nakba are different in lots of ways, but they are both defining traumas for two peoples. And I say,
Yeah.
think about what it would mean if you lived in a society where people denied that the Holocaust had occurred or said that Jews were responsible for it. What would that mean for your ability to actually move on,
Right.
to heal? What would that mean for how how your children dealt with the situation if it was basically buried, right?
Right. Absolutely.
This has been a free preview. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.